Hi, 8th graders. And hello to Power Life students in Ames and Kansas City who are watching right now too. Glad that you guys are all here. I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. How many of you have met somebody famous before? Raise your hand. Yeah, it's kind of a cool thing. I met somebody famous a couple of years ago. It was March of 2018, almost 2 years ago. It was in an airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I recognized him. He's a best-selling, New York Times best-selling author, has sold millions and millions of copies of his books. His name is Lee Strobel. Everyone say Lee Strobel. So Lee's this guy who's this brilliant writer, super smart guy, has become this just incredibly popular author, sold all sorts of books over the years. I've read them myself, and I was so excited because the plane that my wife and I were waiting to get on in the gate at this airport in Charlotte was the same plane he and his wife, Leslie, were waiting to get on. The other thing about Lee Strobel you might not know, there's actually a movie on Netflix about his life story. It's something that you could watch with your family or with friends sometime. It's a really good movie. And it tells the story of how Lee Strobel was this young, brilliant, before he became a best-selling author, a young, brilliant reporter for a big newspaper in Chicago, where I grew up, called the Chicago Tribune. And this is back in the 1970s, and Lee is smart and young, and he's a legal reporter, an investigative reporter, so he becomes kind of a hero in Chicago, even when he's still in his 20s, because he's writing articles that are exposing all this injustice. One person who was accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and Lee discovered the evidence that showed that he was innocent of that crime, and so he was let out of prison, and there's this big celebration, and everybody in Chicago is just like, wow, this Lee Strobel guy is amazing. He's saving people's lives. He's exposing injustice. He's fighting for good over evil. He's this great guy. But the other thing about Lee Strobel and his wife Leslie is they were atheists. You probably know what atheist means, but if you don't, atheist means somebody who doesn't believe there's a God. And Lee Strobel and his wife Leslie were confident because they thought, like some people do still to this day, that smart people like them are going to have a hard time believing in God. Because to believe in God, you have to believe in all these things the Bible talks about, or at least some of the things the Bible talks about that are so sensational, it seems, from the outside looking in. Miracles like the stuff we're talking about at church this month on weekends. I want to encourage you to come to the service this weekend. You'll hear a great story about an awesome miracle. They don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. They think maybe there was this guy Jesus and he died on a cross. No serious historian disputes that. That there was this historical figure. He was a great leader. He was a great teacher. He did some really, really good things for the world. But when he died on the cross, that's the end of the story. People like Lee Strobel and his wife Leslie, they just thought they were too intelligent to believe that like a human being could actually die and then actually rise from the dead for real. They couldn't believe that stuff. And so since they couldn't believe it, they said, well, we're not going to believe in God. We're not going to be Christians. But here's the thing. The Bible reading that you heard at whatever location you're at just a few minutes ago is from 1 Corinthians 15. And in the Bible itself, in that Bible reading, it says, if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, we are wasting our time. We are completely wasting our time. It is so important. Of all the decisions that you ever make, of all the things that you look at, there isn't anything more important than this decision about whether or not you believe Jesus rose from the dead. This is the big one. Because all of Christianity, it's like a house of cards. If this card comes out, the resurrection of Jesus card comes out, the whole house of cards collapses and falls apart. Christianity doesn't exist if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. We're putting all of our faith on it, that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So Lee Strobel was really, really disappointed and shocked to come home one day and discover that his wife Leslie was invited to church. A true story. She got invited to this church in Chicago, this really cool church. And she went to the church, and much to her surprise, she liked it. And more importantly, she liked the message about Jesus. And after that service, she went back again with her friends. And then she went again. And then it was about the third or fourth time she realized, I actually believe this. Much to my surprise, I actually believe in God, and I'm not an atheist anymore. I believe that the Bible is true. I believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead. And now she had to tell her husband. So in that movie that you can see on Netflix, this is what actually happened. True story, when Lee came home from work and Leslie told him that she had become a Christian. He did not take it well. In fact, he took it so poorly, he decided that he was going to write a book, which became a best-selling, million-seller book that would prove that Christianity is a joke. Take a look.
So I went to church, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but I felt something. And so I went again tonight. And I know this is going to be weird to hear because it's weird to say, but I prayed.
So what are you telling me, Les?
I'm saying that I talked to Jesus. I told him I want him in my life.
You what? Why? Why would you?
Hey, stay with me, hon. This is a good thing.
What did this Alfie woman say to you?
It was my decision. Okay?
I don't accept it.
You don't get to accept it. I'm not asking. I'm telling you what happened, and you're not hearing me. Okay. Listen, hon, it's me. This is me talking to you. It's me. Honestly, this is something that I think I've been thinking for a long time, and I just haven't been able to say anything because of who you are.
Are you kidding me, Les?
I know this is a lot.
A lot?
hon.
A lot? You dropped this on me. What does that even mean?
Well, I don't know what it means, but I know it's a good thing for me, for us.
No,
Yes,
okay, okay,
yes.
this is not us, Leslie. Whatever this is, okay, it is not us.
Can you
are
listen
on your
to me
own.
and not get
I
mad?
am listening to you, and that's the problem. So if you're serious about
And
this,
I am.
Okay, well then I don't know what to say to you.
Don't
about
say
whatever
anything then,
this
just
is.
listen to what I'm trying to say because I'm trying to explain that I felt something that is maybe more real than anything I've ever felt in my life.
Kenny, let me ask you something. You're into all this God nonsense.
Wow, you sure know how to term a source.
A bunch of Bible thumpers got to Leslie. I'm afraid she joined your cult. So if somebody wanted to do an investigation into Christianity.
Oh, like a hit piece.
Well, if that's where the evidence leads.
Seems to me you got yourself a catch-22.
What's that?
Well, let's say you debunk Christianity. How's Leslie gonna live with the man who destroyed the very thing that now gives her life meaning?
No, well, because I should be the thing. that
And
gives
then
her
what
life.
if Leslie's right? And you prove your theory of science and reason wrong. How are you gonna live with yourself?
I'm willing to take that chance.
Okay, you're a journalist. Check it out.
Where would you start?
Unless you want to do 2 years of seminary, I'd say go straight for the jugular. The entire Christian faith hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. If it didn't happen, it's a house of cards.
So he did. He dug into it, and he was going to get it published in the Tribune, this whole series of articles saying the case against Christ, that he didn't rise from the dead, the case against the resurrection. And he started to do his research the way a good investigative reporter does. He was so upset that his wife had become a Christian, that she joined this church that he was calling a cult, because it was like they were stealing his wife away from her. And then he started digging into the evidence, and that's when he was blown away. This is a picture that I took when my wife and I were in Jerusalem about 6 years ago. That's Jerusalem up on the hill, and this is a cemetery called the Mount of Olives. This is the mountain where Jesus and his disciples went down. You can't really see the elevation, but trust me when I tell you, it's a pretty steep hill that goes down into this valley where these evergreens are, and then it goes back up the hill to Jerusalem. From this cemetery, there are thousands of people who are buried there over the centuries, hoping that there would be a resurrection where their dead bodies would come out of these tombs at some point and there'd be a resurrection. And you see, this is where people who call themselves intelligent and rational jump ship And they say there's no possible way that dead people can rise from the dead. There's no possible way Jesus rose from the dead. And yet our Bible reading tonight says if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we're wasting our time. So are we? Of course not. Here's a couple more pictures I took in the basement of a church in this city in Jerusalem. In fact, you can see the church in this picture that was built in honor of the place where Jesus was crucified on a cross, and just a few hundred yards away where the tomb was. Here are the tombs that are still there to this day. You can touch them. They still exist, physically exist, these tombs. This could have been the tomb where Jesus' body was laid, and if it wasn't this one, it was one of the ones in the vicinity, an area that's smaller than the stage that I'm standing on right now. Jesus' body was put in one of these tombs. And that's the first thing Lee Strobel discovered that really started to rock his world, is he's like, if Jesus died and he was crucified, and there's no serious historian who disputes that, atheist or believer or anything in between. So Jesus really died. Everybody gets that. And he died on the cross, and his body was put in one of these tombs. But if he really died, then where's his body? Where's his body? People can believe in Buddha, but Buddha's body is still in a tomb to this day. You can actually go find it and get it. People can believe in Muhammad, but Muhammad's body is still in a tomb today. The difference is you can't find Jesus' body in a tomb anywhere, especially in the place where it was laid. And that makes an even bigger case for the resurrection of Christ when you add to the fact that all the people who had all the power, the Roman Empire, the government, the whole government that had the army, that had the soldiers, that had the taxes, that had all the money, that had all the power, and the religious establishment, the priests, the Sanhedrin who ran the temple, they had the laws and the legal system, they controlled it all. They had all the power. The disciples had no power whatsoever. They were running for their lives when Jesus was killed on the cross. So how is it that the people who had all the power couldn't go down into one of these tombs, find Jesus' body, because everybody now was starting to stir, saying, we all know he died on the cross, but now we've seen him risen from the dead. Why is it that they couldn't pull out his dead body and put it out in front of the temple and say he is not risen from the dead? Why couldn't they do it? They had all the power. The people who had no power were out there boldly and courageously saying, he's risen from the dead. We saw him. It completely shocked us, and it blew us away. The people who had all the power could have stopped Christianity in its tracks. It never would have become what it has become. This church would have never been built. If the people who had all the power could find his body, why couldn't they find his body? They were guarding his tomb with a whole regiment of Roman soldiers. Why couldn't they find his body? Well, the most logical explanation is he rose from the dead. But that's not all. The next page of evidence blew Lee Strobel away even more. He did the math. I Googled this. I said, Google, show me a picture of 500 people in an auditorium. That's it. And then show me a picture of an auditorium with 0 people in it. And the reason I did that is because it's 500 to 0. But before I get to that number, I want to tell you about this one. It's 9 to 0. There are 9 ancient sources from the time of Jesus' death and resurrection that all testify to the truth. They're written down on these ancient manuscripts. Not just one person, 9 different people. Some of them in the Bible and some of them outside of the Bible. All of them say the same thing, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Do you want to know how many manuscripts there are written by anybody? By anybody in the same time period who say he didn't rise from the dead? 0. Not one. There are over 500, there's 500 people in this auditorium picture right here. Over 500 people, it says in 1 Corinthians 15, who are eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Paul is basically putting it out there as he writes this letter to the Corinthians, and he says, if you don't believe me, ask them. Most of them are still alive. Go up to them, because they certainly saw Jesus died, they knew he was dead, and now they all saw him alive. Are they all making up the same story? Every single one of them? Well, maybe. Most of them are making up that story, but then there'd be a few people, right, who'd say, no, come on, they're making it up. It's ridiculous. Somebody rational would have said, no, that didn't happen. Here's the truth. There are over 500 people who say Jesus is risen, and they saw him, and they have a story to tell. Do you know how many there are, according to history, who say that they saw his dead body, or that after his resurrection they didn't see him. There's zero people who say he wasn't risen from the dead. There are over 25,000 copies of manuscripts of those 9 ancient sources, all of which are dated back to the time of Jesus' resurrection, that say he rose from the dead. Do you want to know how many copies of manuscripts there are that say he didn't rise from the dead? 0. Do the math. It's not just Lee Strobel. It's people like C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia series. It's other great thinkers, like the greatest scientist of our generation, Francis Collins, who was an atheist until one of his Christian friends says, why don't you look into the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus? And he did, and he wrote, much to my surprise, I looked at the math, I looked at the science, I looked at the evidence, and I realized, oh my goodness, there is no case against the resurrection, and there's a mountain of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You guys, if this is true, and it is, it changes everything. And it's the most important thing in all of human existence. There couldn't be anything in your life today or ever that could possibly be more important than this good news. Because it means there's a God who made you, who loves you so much, he sent his son Jesus into this world to live for you, but also to die for you because he loves you, and he raised this Jesus up from the dead, God did. But here's where it becomes a part of your story. The Bible says if you're a Christian, you belong to Jesus. Here's Jesus, here's you. You belong to him. So if he's put to death, and he was, your sin is put to death. Everything that would keep you from God forever is put to death. If you believe in him, you belong to him. That's what it means to be a Christian. But he didn't stay dead. He rose from the dead. So your death is going to be conquered too. What happened to Jesus will happen to you. The Bible says you've been united with Jesus in his death and resurrection. You belong to him. This is why the resurrection is the biggest deal of anything there could possibly be a big deal about. Lee Strobel's world is getting rocked, and then he discovered something else, a whole bunch of other things. I only have time to do one more, and that's the disciples. How did all of those scared disciples suddenly get so bold and courageous that they're willing to die before they denied the resurrection of Jesus? Because on Good Friday, when Jesus died on a cross, they were nowhere to be found except for one. There were 12 disciples, right? Do you know how many were there at the cross with Jesus of those 12? 1. John. The other 11 were running for their lives. Well, of course, because they belonged to Jesus. And if they're hanging out where Jesus is getting crucified, maybe they're worried the Roman soldiers will nail them to the next cross. Hey, Peter, you were with him. And Peter hears that. He's like, no. And he tells a lie. He says, no, I'm not with him. You got the wrong guy. And he denies him and he runs away. And so did the other disciples, except for John and except for the women, because the women were strong, right? The men, except for John, are all running away. What happened to those men? What happened to those disciples who'd followed Jesus for 3 years? Because they're running for their lives, and within a day, suddenly now they're walking around the public square of Jerusalem boldly and courageously. They're not afraid anymore, even though they'll be thrown in prison for it, even though some of them, most of them, will be executed for it. They're walking around saying, Jesus is risen from the dead. He's risen indeed. You might do that if you have some sort of ulterior motive. You're trying to invent a new religion, or you want some sort of power rush or kick or something. But what about when your group starts getting crucified by the government for it? What if all of your friends start getting killed because they're saying Jesus is risen from the dead, and they were? If it's all a lie, would you die for it? At a certain point, wouldn't you be like, okay, time out. Whoa, we were making it up. We, wanted to start our own religion. And we just decided we'd all get together and come up with this big lie. But then you started executing some of our group, and so we're just going to admit it. We made it all up. Wouldn't you say that? Wouldn't you admit that you were making it all up? So that you wouldn't be put on the next cross and crucified like a bunch of your friends were, or thrown in the next prison for life? What happened to the disciples where suddenly they're the most courageous small group on planet Earth? And they won't shut up no matter what it costs them, even if it costs them their lives. These are the same disciples who are running for their lives just a day before. What happened to them? They saw Jesus. It's the only logical explanation. They saw him risen from the dead. And then there were over 500 more people who saw the same thing. Wouldn't one of them have said, we were making it up? Why did all of them, 500 plus people, all stay and hold to the same truth, saying, we saw the guy you killed alive again. We saw him with our own eyes, and we realize this changes everything. It changes everything. That's what 1 Corinthians 15 says. It says if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we're most of all to be pitied. We're wasting our time. In fact, take a look at this verse. Let's take a closer look at it. If there is no resurrection, there's no living Christ. Then all we're doing is wandering around in the dark. If all we get out of Christ is a little inspiration for a few short years, we're a pretty sorry lot. But the truth is Christ has been raised, the first in a long legacy of those who are going to leave the cemeteries. Because we belong to him. He's conquered our death. He's conquered our sin. The resurrection is real. And there's more. Any rational, intelligent human being who has the courage to look at the evidence, who dares to look at it with an open mind and an open heart, lands in the same place. That Jesus Christ, all the evidence points to this truth. There's a guy named, not just Lee Strobel, a guy named C.S. Lewis, who I said wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, a guy named Simon Greenleaf, who was a Harvard law professor, had his Harvard law class. Half of them, he said, make the legal case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he said to the other half of the class, make the legal case against the resurrection of Jesus Christ, just based on the historical evidence. Approach it intellectually, academically, rationally. Make your case. So half of the Harvard law students made the case for the resurrection of Jesus, and the other half made the case against, and they tried it before a mock jury. And the mock jury came back within a matter of minutes and said no rational journey on planet Earth would be able to hear this evidence and come to any other conclusion that in fact Jesus Christ lived, died, and rose from the dead. And all of the evidence points to this. Turns out our faith is well placed. We are not just taking some blind, crazy leap and saying, well, I hope it's true. Our faith has mountains of evidence to support it. And because it's true, it changes everything. It did for Lee Strobel, and this is the moment, true story, where he looked at all the evidence he had compiled, the three things that I pointed out tonight, but a whole lot more too. And this is the point where he became a Christian. And it was an important moment. It changed everything for him, just like it will for you when the resurrection of Jesus becomes your reality. Take a look.
Father, please soften Lee's heart. Put a new spirit in him. Remove from him his heart of stone and give him a heart of flesh.
The only way to truth is through facts.
The entire Christian faith hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. If it didn't happen, it's a house of cards.
No, you just have to show that Jesus died and he was seen after.
How can we be sure of the reliability of those manuscripts?
Archaeologists have recovered 5,843 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Nothing else in history even comes close.
You trust the Journal of the American Medical Association?
Yes, Jesus Christ died on that cross.
You're not telling me what I hope to hear today.
What if it is true? Wouldn't you want to know that?
The first recorded account tells us that he was buried in a tomb. The empty tomb is based on evidence. Isn't evidence your trade?
Faith is the evidence of things we can't actually see.
Any careful historian will see that the core account is consistent, even if a few of the secondary details are told from different perspectives.
500 separate people saw Jesus at the same time.
That would be an even bigger miracle than the resurrection itself.
The disciples reported what actually
People with
happened.
zero motivation to lie.
When is enough evidence enough evidence?
I felt something that is maybe more real than anything I've ever felt in my life.
This is not a condition anyone can
Still takes a leap of faith.
But why would he do it?
It's really very simple. Love.
my God. You win.
And that's the moment that changed his life forever, just like it will anybody's, including yours, when you let the resurrection of Jesus become real for you. Lee Strobel changed one word in the title of his book that he was writing to debunk Christianity. It was going to be called The Case Against Christ. Instead, when he looked at the evidence, he decided, just for intellectual honesty, he had to change it to The Case for Christ. And that's the name of the movie on Netflix that you can watch, The Case for Christ. You can catch the whole story. Here's the rest of that story from the Charlotte airport, where I met the famous Lee Strobel. I'd actually met him a few hours before at a funeral. He was there and I was there. We were invited to the funeral of Billy Graham, who was a big-time evangelist, probably the biggest evangelist in the world over the last century. And his funeral was in Charlotte last March of 2018. And Lee was there because he's a big deal. I was invited with my wife, Sally, because they wanted someone to represent the Lutheran Church in America. And as it turns out, we ended up sitting, my wife and I, right next to Lee and Leslie Strobel. And this was before the movie came out, but I'd read his book, like millions of other people had. I was like, whoa, man, that's Lee Strobel. And so I told him how influential I think he's been for so many people. And he turned out to be, you'd think a guy who's written million-dollar best-selling books could have a big head. He's the nicest guy in the world. Humble, super funny, super smart, on fire for his faith in Jesus Christ, wanted to know all about this Lutheran church in Iowa that I was a part of, wanted to know the whole story, wanted to know I cheered for the Bears, all this kind of stuff. And we just had this awesome conversation. When I was sitting next to him at the airport at the gate, I had my phone out and I got a text. This is just how God writes stories if you let him. I got a text from a reporter who used to be a reporter for the Des Moines Register, and then he started writing books and is becoming pretty famous. He's still a young guy. 10 years ago or so, he was assigned to do a story on Lutheran Church of Hope, and he didn't believe in God until he came here and he saw what God is doing here through you, through your generosity, through your spirit, through your giving, more importantly, through what the Bible says Jesus is. He started looking into it, and just like Lee Strobel and so many others, he was overwhelmed by the evidence. And one of the things that I did is I gave him the book, The Case for Christ, by Lee Strobel. I said, you should read this. It was written by a reporter just like you. Well, this reporter who used to work for the Des Moines Register and who I knew actually texted me while I'm sitting there next to Lee Strobel talking about The Case for Christ. I said, you got to believe this. I said, the guy who wrote the book, who God used to help lead you to faith in Jesus, is sitting right next to me right now. And my friend says, well, where are you? I said, I'm at the Charlotte airport. He goes, you're not going to believe this. So am I. I'm waiting for a plane and it's delayed 4 hours and I got nothing to do. Can I come see you guys? Can I meet my hero author? I'm like, yeah, come on down. So he comes down and we're all talking. That's the way God moves. He's writing your story too if you let him. And I believe he brought you here tonight so that you could hear that the resurrection of Jesus is real, not just for Lee Strobel or for this reporter from the Des Moines Register, but for you. And if it's true for you, well, that changes everything. That changes your future. That changes your hope. You realize how well placed it is. That changes your confidence in the resurrection. That changes what you live for right now. That changes the way you see your good days and your bad days. That gives you everything. Because God loves you. That's the part of that last scene I really wanted you to see. It's not just what happened, Jesus rose from the dead. It's why. Because of you. Because he loves you. He was willing to go to a cross and die for you. And then he won a victory for you because you belong to him as a Christian. He won a victory for you over the grave. And that's going to give you a life. Get a life!